Few know the battles that shaped empires' medieval history, uncovers conflicts lost to time. Armies clashed in fields where history forgot their names. The fate of kings and kingdoms hung on these forgotten fights. The echoes of these battles still whisper through the ruins of empires. A pale dawn crept over the frost-laden valley, where shattered palisades and charred wagons whispered the echoes of men long fallen. The wind carried the scent of damp earth blood and smoldering pine, mingling with the faint metallic temps of discarded swords and rusted armor. A young squire knelt beside the remnants of a fallen standard, tracing the faded insignia with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of lives extinguished in service to kings he had never known. Around him, the silence of the battlefield pressed upon the soul, broken only by the distant caw of a raven. Perched upon a splintered tower, surveying the carnage with patient indifference, he imagined the clamor that had once filled the valley. Hoofbeats pounding against sodden soil, the clash of steel, the roar of men driven by loyalty, fear, or ambition, each moment now compressed into the still aching hush of aftermath. In the nearby woods, frost clung to twisted branches. A thin veil of mist swirled among the graves, hastily dug for the nameless dead, their faces obscured by mud and memory. The squire's gaze lingered on a shattered helmet, its dented visor reflecting the pale light like a haunted eye, a testament to the folly and sacrifice that had decided the fate of kingdoms. The banners that remained fluttered, faintly tugged by the wind, each movement a soft echo of triumph and despair intertwined beneath. The quiet sky beyond the valley, the remains of siege engines lay broken in the mud, their wheels splintered, their ropes frayed, the scars of strategy etched in stone and soil. The squire traced his fingers over a rusted sword hilt, feeling the cold bite of iron and the invisible pulse of men who had fallen clutching it in their final moments. Their intentions lost to time, yet written in the grooves of metal and the imprints upon the earth. The battlefield itself became a ledger of ambition, courage, and recklessness, where kings' fates were bound to the whims of mortal flesh. Shadows stretched long across the frozen ground as the sun lifted higher, illuminating fragments of banners and discarded shields. The air trembled with the memory of cries, the wind carrying whispers of commands shouted in the heat of battle and prayers uttered in fear. The squire felt the burden of these unrecorded histories pressing upon him, the lives entwined in victory and defeat, the choices that had tipped the scale of kingdoms now silent, yet unforgotten. The earth beneath him held the imprint of thousands of footsteps, of men who had charged without knowing if they would see the next sunrise. In the quiet corners of the field, the faint glimmer of a jeweled brooch caught the morning light, lying among mud and broken armor, a small symbol of wealth and ambition, now touched by dust and decay. The squire bent to retrieve it, feeling a shiver run through him, as if the object carried the breath of those who had owned it before. The tales of deceit and valor lingering in its facets, the relics scattered across the battlefield were not merely objects. They were witnesses, vessels of memory binding the living to the dead and the present to the vanished pastas. He moved through the wreckage of campfires and shattered carts. He could see where the earth had been torn by catapults and arrows, where men had fallen in desperate formations, where hope and fear had collided in a moment that would define dynasties. The squire's breath rose in thin clouds, each exhale a visible reminder of life amidst the omnipresent weight of loss, the rusted chain of a harness caught the sunlight, a faint glimmer in the frost, reminding him that history bore consequences beyond those who had intended them. The valley lay in a fragile balance, the aftermath of battle frozen in time, each element from the broken weapons to the empty standards, a testament to decisions made in haste or honor or ambition. The squire paused atop a small rise, gazing across the field, the scattered remnants telling stories of courage that went unnoticed and treachery that left invisible scars. The wind whispered through broken towers, carrying echoes of the past into the present, a reminder that the consequences of human desire and loyalty lingered long after swords had fallen silent from his knees. The squire adjusted his cloak, the chill of dawn biting at his fingers, yet the warmth of remembrance pressing upon his chest. He walked slowly among the remnants of the fallen, tracing the patterns of history written in mud, metal, and bone. Each artifact, each fragment of armor held a lesson of the fragile line between triumph and ruin, the enduring imprint of battles, forgotten by chronicles, yet etched into the soil and memory of men. The valley breathed with the lives that had passed through it, each gust of wind a whisper of what had been decided by courage, fear, and the unrelenting hand of fate. As he left the battlefield, the sun climbed higher, illuminating the distant hills. The squire glanced back at the valley, the frozen silence, a canvas for stories that would shape kingdoms. The lessons of ambition, loyalty, and folly were scattered across the ground, waiting for those who would remember their weight. The path forward carried the echoes of every choice, every charge, every fall, a continuum of consequence that would guide the living and honor the dead as the forgotten battles continued to decide the fate of entire kingdoms. A storm rumbled over jagged hills, rattling the wooden gates of a besieged castle, carrying with it the sharp tang of iron sweat and smoke. From a vantage point atop a crumbling tower, a herald watched the distant armies, their banners flickering like fire against gray skies, each color a promise of honor or a warning of ruin. He remembered tales of battles fought not for glory, but for survival, of peasants pressed into service of knights, whose loyalty bent beneath the weight of kings. Ambitions, the clang of swords, and the cries of the wounded had long since faded, yet their echo lingered in the cold wind, threading the stones beneath his feet and the rusted spikes along the battlements below. Frost-glazed mud bore the imprints of hooves and feet, a frozen record of charge and retreat, of moments when a single misstep could doom a banner, a family, an entire lineage. A tattered pennant caught in the branches of a tree, its frayed edges snapping in the wind, became a symbol of vanished hope and decisive failure. The herald pressed his hand to the cold stone, feeling the vibrations of history beneath his palm, the invisible pulse of courage, fear, and betrayal that had decided kingdoms. Each scar upon the walls, each dent in the gate carried the memory of choices made in desperation, of valor tested, and of ambition that had stretched beyond reason. Lightning split the sky, revealing the distant forests where men had fallen unseen. The earth turned with blood and mud, their sacrifice recorded only in the hollow sighs of wind. Through shattered battlements, the herald's eyes traced the lines of the battlefield, imagining the tumult of strategy and panic, the clash of wills where a single shout could rally hope or herald despair. Every footprint, every broken weapon, every snapped banner told a story of fleeting triumphs and irrevocable losses. The pulse of past warriors lingering in the cold air, as if the storm itself remembered their efforts and their failures. The castle's walls shivered under the gusts, carrying with them the scent of wet stone and burnt timber. The herald imagined the knights who had charged with hearts ablaze, the peasants whose trembling hands had held spears meant to protect, yet offered little hope. Each moment of hesitation, each surge of courage had echoed across the valley, shaping destinies far beyond the reach of those who had acted or fallen. The distant cry of a raven cut through the storm, a fleeting shadow over frost and ruin, a reminder that the consequences of valor and error were eternal, suspended between memory and silence. Amid the shattered gates and broken palisades, the herald noted the fragments of banners that had once flown proud over the battlefield. The glimmer of a broken sword blade catching stray lightning, the faint impression of a horse's hoof in the mud. Each fragment was a testament, a tangible echo of lives pressed into the service of ambition, loyalty, and fear. The herald pressed closer to the edge of the tower, eyes scanning the valley, imagining the chaos and order entwined, the cries of victory drowned by the moan of defeat. Each element of the ruined field spoke of choices made in desperation and the fragile line between triumph and ruin. The storm shifted, the air carrying whispers of the fallen through arches and corridors of stone. The herald's cloak flapping against the cold battlements. His gaze lingered on the distant armies, now motionless in the sheets of rain, yet alive in memory. The banners and pennants, reminders of the ambition that had driven men to acts of bravery and folly alike. Every stone beneath him, every dented spike, every shard of broken timber was a silent witness to the cost of king's desires. The price of loyalty, the enduring mark of courage, pressed into earth and history as the rain softened and the storm receded. A pale light touched the valley, revealing mud-streaked banners and scattered helmets. The herald stepped back from the edge, breathing in the cold air, feeling the pulse of centuries beneath the stones. Beneath his hands, the battlefield lay quiet, yet alive in memory, a record of the human spirit, tested in extremity, and of kingdoms decided not by words, but by blood, courage, and error. His eyes followed a lone raven, tracing the skies above the valley, a living symbol that the stories of sacrifice, ambition, and fate continued to linger in every wind that swept across the frozen fields, preparing the path for those who would bear witness to the weight of history and the silent consequences of battles forgotten. Mist curled around the remains of a ruined bridge, slick with frost and the frozen footprints of men and horses long vanished. A lone archer crouched in the shadow of a moss-covered wall, bow trembling in his hand, recalling the clash of armies that had raged here when kingdoms teetered on the edge of oblivion. The acrid smoke of torches and burning villages had long since dissipated, leaving only the earthy scent of decay and iron. Broken shields, their heraldry scratched and blackened, lay half buried among frozen mud and scattered arrows, silent witnesses to strategy, courage, and the cruelties inflicted by necessity. He touched a fallen sword, its hilt cold and pitted, and felt the pulse of history, the tremor of decisions made in haste. That determined survival or annihilation. Each scar upon the stone, each dent in timber, carried the memory of men who had fought not for glory, but for duty and fear of failure. The archer's eyes traced the path of retreat, and advanced imagining. The shouts, the cries, the weight of armor pressing against trembling shoulders. The valley beyond the bridge remained silent, yet alive in memory, every ripple of frost upon the river. Every shadow across broken earth, a testament to choices made under pressure and the fragile boundary between triumph and ruin. Birds flitted across the desolate battlefield, their wings beating against the gray sky. The sound, a faint echo of war cries that had once split the air with fury and despair. Broken helmets lay caked with mud and ice, their dented visors reflecting pale light like the haunted eyes of men who would never rise again. The archer felt the presence of those vanished warriors in the chill of the wind and in the hush that settled over the frozen earth. Each arrow shaft, each splintered plank, each crushed standard whispered of loyalty, tested courage, expended, and the unrecorded acts of heroism and folly that had shaped the fates of kings and commoners, alike. In the distance, a ruined chapel stood, its roof caved, yet within its walls, whispers of prayers and vows endured like ghosts, a testament to the intertwined fate of faith and war. The archer's gaze lingered on the fractured stained glass, imagining the hands that had once traced them in devotion or desperation. The walls bore silent witness to the suffering of both conqueror and conquered, to the weight of vows made in the shadow of death, and to the unyielding presence of hope clinging to splintered stone. As the archer rose, the mist parted to reveal the valley beyond, where frost sparkled on the river like scattered diamonds, each gleam a silent symbol of both the beauty and the brutality that had shaped kingdoms. The shattered bridge and scattered banners spoke of ambition fulfilled or crushed, the cost of decisions made under fear, and the echoes of sacrifice pressing upon those who survived. Each frozen footprint, each broken weapon, each abandoned standard was a record of courage weighed against mortality, of the fragile line between remembrance and oblivion. He stepped forward, tracing the path through frost-hardened mud, the remnants of strategy etched in earth and stone. The archer imagined the countless choices made in fleeting moments. When a hand lifted a bow, when a sword swung or faltered, the frozen battlefield held the memory of desperation, of fleeting bravery, and of errors whose consequences rippled through generations. The chapel bells, long silenced, seemed to toll in spirit, carrying the weight of prayers for mercy, vengeance, and protection over the valley and the men who had vanished into history. The wind carried the scent of iron and pine through the valley, stirring the mist across the frozen river and broken bridge. Each breath drawn was filled with the weight of memory, the unspoken testimony of those who had shaped kingdoms with steel, courage, and fear. The archer paused, his eyes following the horizon, where jagged hills met the gray sky, imagining the forces that had collided in this place, the fragile line between survival and annihilation, visible only in the scattered relics beneath his feet. In that moment, the valley seemed to hold its breath, the frozen battlefield a silent chronicle of valor loss, and the relentless passage of history. The archer turned from the bridge, from the chapel, from the remnants of men and armies, long gone yet present in every shadow, every frost-covered stone, every whisper of wind across the river. He stepped forward into the path that would lead to the next tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unseen cost of victory, the story of men whose lives were claimed not only by the clash of swords, but by the fragile threads of fate that determined the destiny of kingdoms. Thunder rolled across the hills as rain fell in icy sheets, hammering the wooden palisades and churned mud below. A wounded knight leaned against the sodden earth in a narrow trench armor, dented and caked with blood and clay. Listening to the distant cries of those lost and the ghostly whistle of the wind through shattered towers, the banners of once mighty houses lay torn and sodden colors bleeding into the mud like memories of ambition and pride. Nearby, a small child clutched a rusted helmet, the metal cold and jagged against her palm, imagining the fathers, brothers, and uncles who would never return. Piece of debris-shattered cart, broken spear, upturned shield held stories of choices that had altered the course of realms' smoke. From distant fires mingled with the scent of rain and the iron temps of spilled blood, forming an invisible tapestry of history that stretched across valleys and forests. The knight's eyes traced the mud-flooded paths where courage had met despair, where the hesitant advance of a soldier had shifted the fate of a banner and the kingdoms it represented. Each movement, each fallen body carried the weight of sacrifice, measured in breaths. A raven perched upon a splintered gate, tilting its head as if watching a silent witness to the human cost of strategy, miscalculation, and hubris. The bird's black feathers glistened with rain, and its gaze seemed to pierce the veil of time, seeing the moments when loyalty fractured, when fear overwhelmed, and when ambition drove men to acts of reckless courage. The knight's hand rested on the hilt of a dented sword, feeling the pulse of decisions made too quickly under pressure, and the tremor of consequences that rippled far beyond the battlefield. Castle walls rose in the distance, battered, yet unbowed, reflecting the pale light through the storm. Their shadows stretched across the mud as a reminder that kingdoms hung not on the strength of stone, but on the fragile courage and sacrifice of those willing to bear the weight of fate. The child's fingers tightened around the rusted helmet, imagining the stories embedded in every dent, every scratch, every faded crest. The wind carried the echoes of shouts, the clash of steel, and the cries of the fallen across the valley, creating a resonance of memory that seemed to linger long after the armies had vanished. The knight rose, slowly, each movement laborious with pain, and cold eyes scanning the horizon. He imagined the currents of battle, the rapid decisions, the acts of mercy and cruelty that had determined the lives of thousands. The storm seemed to pause for a heartbeat between thunderclaps, as though the world itself held its breath, watching the scales of fortune tilt with each human action. Every raindrop striking armor or mud whispered the same truth, that victory and defeat were measured not only by skill, but by the endurance of hope and the willingness to stand when all seemed lost. Smoke twisted with rain over distant tree lines, marking the places where homes had burned and where fields once fertile lay trampled under hooves and feet. The knight's gaze followed the paths of retreat and charge, tracing the invisible lines of consequence that would echo through generations. The child remained crouched near her, the trench holding the helmet close, her imagination filling the gaps left by absence with visions of valor, despair, and the unseen. Threads of fate that connected lives across time, each shattered cart, each broken spear, each tattered banner told a story of ambition, tested by nature and human error alike. The battlefield seemed suspended, a mirror of history's judgment, reflecting the fleeting courage and enduring suffering of men who had fought without certainty of reward or recognition. The distant castles bore witness their battered walls, a testament to the persistence of power, even as blood and rain eroded the paths that led to them. The knight's breath fogged in the cold air, and he felt the weight of choices past pressing upon him, the invisible chains that bound the living to the departed, and the living to the memory of those who would never return. A final clap of thunder shook the valley, sending droplets cascading from the walls and banners. The knight lowered his gaze, tracing the frozen rivulets of water in the mud, remembering the fallen and the paths they had carved into history. The raven took flight above the trench, cutting across the gray sky, a fleeting shadow of vigilance and silence. A hush settled over the battlefield, a moment of reflection in which the storm and its memory intertwined, the courage of the living with the sacrifice of the dead, preparing the listener for the next chapter, where the untold stories of strategy, ambition, and survival would unfold across the lands of medieval kingdoms. A gray fog wrapped the valley in a cold embrace, softening the contours of hills and fields that had once trembled under the chaos of battle. Amid the mud and splintered wood, a standard lay half-buried, its emblem faded, each thread soaked with rain. And memory, a young messenger, knelt beside it, hands trembling, feeling the chill seep through his gloves and into his bones, imagining the soldiers who had fallen defending or contesting this fragile line of earth. The acrid scent of sweat, blood, and fear clung to the ground, etched into stones and timber alike. Broken spears and shattered shields lay scattered across the field, silent witnesses to decisions made in haste, strategies misunderstood, and bravery unseen by kings who now dined in safety. The messenger's eyes caught the glint of a dented helm, sunlight refracting through the rain-soaked visor like shards of memory. A blackbird wheeled overhead, its shadow fleeting across the mud, a reminder of the unseen hand of history guiding outcomes beyond human control. In the distance, a ruined chapel stood, its charred beams whispering of prayers and oaths broken and kept alike. A subtle echo of voices lost in time seemed to rise from its walls, the fragile interweaving of faith, duty, and mortality pressing against the silence of the valley. Each mark upon stone and timber, each dent and crack in armor told of courage, tested by fear, and loyalty strained by necessity. The messenger ran a finger along the edge of the standard, feeling the weight of countless choices pressing through the fabric of history. The fog shifted, revealing the expanse of the valley, the muted glow of sunlight glinting off wet mud and metal. A sense of quiet lingered where once there had been clamor, the echoes of hooves and swords now replaced by wind slipping through broken palisades and the rustle of leaves. A shattered cart bore testament to hurried retreat. A torn banner marked the line where a regiment had faltered. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath, preserving the memory of the fallen, a canvas of loss and fleeting triumph on which kingdoms had been built and undone. The messenger rose slowly, his boots sinking into the soaked earth, the cold gnawing at his resolve. Each step traced the path of history, the choices of generals, the courage of common men, the fragile acts of mercy that could tip the scale from victory to annihilation. His eyes followed the skeletal trees lining the horizon, imagining the moments when a decision to hold or flee had shifted the destiny of thousands. The valley seemed alive with those moments, preserved in the whisper of fog and the shimmer of rain. Above the chapel, a blackbird perched once more, tilting its head, as if surveying the valley, the endless testament to human ambition. Ambition measured in courage, sacrifice, and loss. Each broken shield, each dented helm told of hope, held against impossible odds and despair that had claimed those who faltered. The messenger's breath misted in the cold air, his gaze lingering on the paths where armies had clashed, imagining the faces of men who had never returned and the hands of those who would carry memory forward. The sun broke briefly through the fog, casting a pale light across the battlefield, highlighting the waterlogged ruts and scattered debris. Its rays touched the chapel, the standard, the twisted remnants of what had once been a stage of chaos and decision. Every shadow seemed to echo with the weight of choices. Every glint of metal, a reflection of courage tested beyond measure. The messenger felt the pulse of history beneath his feet, the invisible line connecting past and present, the fragile thread by which kingdoms had survived or fallen as he stepped toward the distant hills. The fog curled around him, revealing glimpses of paths that had decided fates and shaped dynasties. The valley lay silent, yet resonant with the memory of those who had fought and died unseen by kings who feasted in halls. Far from the mud and blood, here the stories of sacrifice and consequence lingered, etched into earth, stone, and steel, calling the observer to witness the deeper truths of courage, ambition, and the unseen cost of victory, preparing the mind to follow the next chapter where the human will and fate would collide across the medieval world. The first light of dawn struck the tops of battered siege engines, glinting off rain-slicked wood and iron casting. Long shadows over a field pocked with mud and discarded armor. A veteran soldier knelt beside a fallen banner, fingers brushing over soaked cloth and frayed stitching, recalling the roar of men, the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the anguish of decisions made too late. The air was sharp with wet earth and smoldering timber, tinged faintly with the copper of spilt blood around him. The remnants of the army lay silent, helmets, dented arrows, splintered shields, scuffed and marred, a language of survival and failure, carved into mud and timber. Each piece spoke of courage, tested by fear and loyalty, strained by necessity. The wind tugged at a broken pennant, its frayed edges snapping like faint echoes of valor and despair. A raven alighted on a toppled siege tower, wings folded, watching with the patience of eternity as the soldier traced the line of sight where his comrades had charged and faltered. Each frozen impression of boot or hoof, each splintered plank whispered of choices that had decided the rise or fall of kings, of villages burned or spared, of families forged in victory or lost in ruin. The veteran's hand lingered on the wet earth, feeling the pulse of history beneath his palm, the tremor of human effort and error that had shaped the valley into a graveyard of ambition and survival. Smoke from distant fires mingled with the scent of mud, a reminder that memory clings even when flesh turns to soil. The soldier rose slowly, boots squelching in the thick mud, his eyes sweeping over the battlefield. Where once men had bled for banners and honor, now the field was quiet, yet full of the residue of passion and fear. Each dent in armor, each splintered wheel, a story of hope and defeat, intertwined with the inexorable march of time. In the distance, the river glimmered silver beneath the rising sun, tracing a path through the scarred land, a fragile mirror of continuity. And Chanjay's tattered helm caught the light, its visor cracked and dull, like the haunted gaze of a fallen warrior. The soldier touched it reverently, imagining the life it had, shielded the decisions made in the heat of conflict. The terror and courage etched in every dent. The wind stirred the banners, remaining on shattered engines, tugging at their fibers, as if echoing the sighs of men long gone. Each sound, a whisper from the past, urging remembrance and reflection on the fragile line between survival and oblivion. Above the valley, a raven took wing, circling once before settling again. Atop a splintered tower, its shadow fleeting across the mud and debris, a sense of suspended time hung over the field, as though the earth itself retained the memory of strategy, ambition, and fear. Each footprint and broken shield seemed to hum with the choices that had steered kingdoms and claimed lives. Unseen by those who had set them in motion, the soldier followed the patterns in the mud, tracing charges, retreats, and decisive moments. Frozen by frost and memory, the sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of devastation. Intertwined with moments of quiet beauty, the wet wood of siege engines reflected light like dark glass. The mud glistened with rain like scattered gems, each shard of metal a witness to human frailty and resolve. The veteran felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, the invisible hand of consequence guiding the outcomes of men who could no longer answer for their actions. As he turned toward the distant hills, the valley unfolded beneath the pale morning light, a tapestry of courage, sacrifice, and loss. Each torn banner, each splintered wheel, each dented helm, a chapter in a story that stretched beyond the field, beyond the armies, beyond the reach of memory. Yet the lessons lingered, the subtle currents of cause and effect, shaping the fates of villages, kingdoms, and families. The soldier's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the valley met the mist, hinting at more stories of valor, error, and unseen forces, waiting to be traced and remembered in the continuing sweep of medieval history. A low mist hugged the riverbanks, where catapults had once hurled stones and flaming arrows scorched the forested hills. The scent of wet wood iron and scorched grass lingered, mingling with the faint sweetness of crushed wildflowers trampled beneath. Boots, a young scout, knelt beside a broken spear, running fingers along the rough wood and cold metal, recalling the roar of armies colliding, the shouts of commanders, the cries of the dying, and the quiet moments of hesitation that had turned the tide of kingdoms. Across the valley, frost-laden fields bore subtle impressions of hooves, human feet, and carts frozen in time. Like a map of triumph and despair, each mark told of courage tested by fear and decisions made in haste. The scout's gaze rested on a shattered shield, its paint faded and scarred, a silent witness to valor and misjudgment alike. Ravens wheeled in the gray sky above, their cries a chorus of remembrance and warning, echoing the pulse of history that lingered even in silence. Ruins of a chapel stood in the distance, roof collapsed, walls cracked, its stones breathed the memory of prayers offered and forgotten, a testament to the fragile intertwining of faith and strategy, where devotion had guided decisions as much as the sword. Each beam and arch carried the weight of those who had sought sanctuary only to find the battlefield creeping ever closer. Their whispers lingered in the damp air, a reminder that no victory was without cost and no defeat without meaning. The scout traced the line of the river, watching frost glint against splintered timber and upturned earth. each frozen imprint a ledger of lives spent and decisions weighed. Heavy against ambition and necessity, the wind stirred the cloak around his shoulders, tugging at the edges, stiff with frost, carrying the faint tang of iron and earth, as though the valley itself remembered the tide of battle. The echo of hooves and marching men seemed to hum faintly beneath the mist, as if the ghosts of strategy lingered in invisible patterns across the frozen field fingers. Brushing a dented helmet, the scout felt the pulse of choices made in panic or courage, the fragile human threads that had shifted the fates of kings and villages alike. Each scarred piece of wood or metal told of sacrifice, of error, of ambition, pressed into the fabric of the valley where the living now tread lightly. Each step measured against the silent testimony of those who had fallen and those who had endured. Lone Raven alighted upon a fractured palisade, wings folding as it watched the valley spread beneath. The gray sky, its presence, was a quiet witness, a sentinel of memory, observing the remnants of triumph and miscalculation. The scout rose slowly, eyes scanning the horizon, where frost-kissed riverbanks and timber lay broken. Each glance captured the tension between beauty and devastation, the interplay of survival and loss, the unseen forces that had guided the outcomes of men long gone. The ruined chapel's shadows stretched across the mud as the mist began to lift, revealing the full expanse of the valley. A landscape where every blade of grass, every splintered plank, and each frozen footprint carried the story of kingdoms won and lost, of human resolve pressed against fate, each mark a whisper to those who would listen, teaching the subtle lessons of courage, sacrifice, and the invisible currents that had shaped medieval history. The scout adjusted the cloak around his shoulders, stepping over frozen footprints and shattered spears. The valley before him was a ledger of ambition and consequence, where the smallest hesitation or act of bravery could ripple across generations. Each riverbend and broken siege engine told of men who had dared to challenge destiny, and of those who had paid the price in blood and memory. The frost reflected the pale sunlight like scattered diamonds, each glint a reminder that even in devastation there was the trace of beauty and order. He turned his gaze toward the hills beyond the mist. The scout saw the valley as both grave and classroom, a place where the weight of history pressed upon the present. Each stone, timber, and mark upon the field, a guidepost for understanding how faith, courage, and folly intertwined to shape the medieval world. The frozen impressions beneath his feet seemed to murmur of battles that had decided the fate of kingdoms. Lessons etched into the earth, waiting for eyes patient enough to see and hands steady enough